Hello, welcome to part 2 of Unit 5. Today we're going to be looking at the shooter and specifically how to add the player and a bunch of other things. So the first thing I need you to do is go ahead and go into Desire to Learn, D2L, go to the Content section. Way back in Unit 1 there was a file called Shooter Project Windows. I would like you to go ahead and download that and place it into your projects directory. So your projects directory for Visual Studio is going to be inside of Documents. So go to Documents, and then inside of there you're going to have a directory called Visual Studio 2010, and then inside of that you're going to have a directory called Projects. This is where you want to put the shooter start project. I simply open this up and took this shooter and dragged it into this thing. I actually called mine shooter start. Shooter end is the full project that I showed you last time. And then from there you want to open it on up. So go ahead and go to Open and go to your shooter and go to the shooter Microsoft Visual Studio solution file and open that up. Now you're going to notice there's already a whole bunch of stuff in here for you. There's art in the form of some background layers, some explosions, some laser beams. Here's a background layer piece, for example. Here's another one. We're going to use these to create some parallaxing effects. Here's a end menu, for example. Here's a main menu for the shooter project. All kinds of stuff that Microsoft provided for us, basically. So that's what we're going to use. Now, the rest of this is pretty much off-the-shelf new Visual Studio XNA program stuff. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a player class. That's the first thing we're going to do. Usually in games, the first thing you start with is the player. There's sort of a rule of thumb in games, which is players first. I'm just going to write that down here. Players first. So the idea is that you start with create the player, create movement for the player, then you can start creating the level logic. The player is always a good place to start, and so what we're doing is no different. We're going to go ahead and start with creating the player. So to create the player, we can go ahead and go to File, Add, or I'm sorry, not File, Add. We go to Shooter, Add. Happy clicking today. Shooter, Add, New Item. And this might take a while. Sometimes it does that. And we're going to go ahead and add a class. And down here we want to rename this player. So player.cs. And it will go ahead and add that to the project for us. And you can see the namespace shooter class player. So in our player we're going to add some methods. Add an update. We should probably add an initialize as well. And consulting our handy dandy diagram, we also need to do draw. So we're going to need a draw method. Draw is right down here. So I'm going to add a draw method. Next up, now that we have that, oh, and by the way, these are methods. These are going to be called, this one is going to be called at the start, this one's going to be called every tick, kind of our update logic, and this one's going to keep getting called to draw the player. Now we also want to add some instance variables to our class. These are going to be comprised of things like health, position, whether or not it's active, all that kind of stuff. So we want to go ahead and add those. I'm going to speed up time here and explain them in great detail, but hold on just one sec. Okay, so I've just added a whole slew of new instance variables. And by the way, if you do what I just did, you'll notice that texture 2D and vector 2D are not being recognized. That's because we got to add using Microsoft.xna.framework and Microsoft.xna.framework.graphics. So in turn, here are the instance variables that we've added. You can think of instance variables as things that basically exist on the player to be manipulated. So if we had, for example, more than one player, we would have, player 1, and this guy's got a texture, so he's got his player texture, and he's got his position, he's got whether or not he's active, he's got a health. If, just hypothetically, we had a player 2, this would also have a player texture position, because of course players don't always have to be in the same position. In fact, they're probably rarely in the same position. They also don't need to have the same health value. Some of them could be inactive. So these are variables that are stored on the object, on the player object. So this player object is going to have the texture, the position, the whether or not it's actually active at the current moment, what the current health is, what the width of the ship is. This is going to be used for collision later, as well as what the height is. And notice that I have initialized some getter functions here. You should have recognized this from the videos that Peter Bresnay did. This is basically a get width field, which returns the player width, and this is a get height method, which returns the player texture's height. So that is how that works. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we've got a couple different types of variables that we've declared. One is an int, that's the health. That's going to be a whole number like 0, 1, 42. We've got a bool, that's going to be a boolean. That's, for example, a flag. That's going to be either true or false. A vector 2D is our position. It's going to have an x and a y position. Those are represented independently of each other. That's going to be our position in space. So when we run the game, that's going to be where the ship is in space. And then texture 2D is our two-dimensional graphic. That's a special data type that holds the graphical data. That's going to be drawn out to the screen. So next thing we're going to want to do is update our initialize function so that we set a new texture as well as a new position. It's going to look like the following. Basically, this is going to take a texture as a parameter. It's going to take a position, and it's going to set, we're going to do player texture equals texture, because remember the player texture is the instance variable that's on the player, and we're setting it to the incoming texture, which is this value here. We then set its position, so we say capital P position equals lowercase position, and we set it to be active, and we give the player a default health of 100. So we've set up our player, and of course update is going to change the ship over time, but even before we do that, I want to just draw something to the screen and just see it working. So I'm going to go ahead and replace our draw method with something that will actually draw out the texture. Here we've got spritebatch.draw, player texture, position. This is similar to what we did in the ball tutorial. Basically, it's taking in a sprite batch, and that sprite batch is going to be drawn out to the screen. Color white for the alpha mask, and then vector 0 for the position that it's drawing it in, and then 1f sprite effects.none and 0f for the final parameter, which is the layer depth. So that is all we need for the draw function for now. The rest we're going to basically do via calling the draw. So the next thing we got to do is actually create our player. So for that, we're going to switch over to game1.cs. Somewhere just below sprite batch, I want you to put in a player definition. So we call that player, and player. So that's going to define our player. We also want to initialize our player. So if you see this protected method here, this looks like a good place to initialize the player. And we say player equals new player. Note that what this is doing is creating a new space and memory for the player. Before, we defined what the player was, but we didn't actually define a new player. We just defined what the player is going to look like. Think of this as like the blueprint, for example, of what a potential player would look like. But in game1.cs, when we actually call new player, we're actually creating a player. So if we go back to our player analogy that I have, or I guess I had this before in Notepad, we had a player 1 and a player 2. So each of these would be a new, you'd call the new operator, you'd call new player 1, new player 2. Each of those is going into this thing called the blueprint, which is the player.cs. These become instances. So in that same sense, the lowercase word player here is our instance that's been created of the type player, and generally speaking, a lot of new objects have empty constructors on them. This one has a left paren and a right paren. You can pass in parameters if you want, but our player actually does not take any additional parameters because we haven't defined it to do so yet. So that creates our new player. Next up, we actually want to load the player content. So we know that before in the ball game tutorial, for example, we knew that we had to do that inside of load content. So I'm going to go ahead and do that down here. We're going to say load up the new player position to be a certain value and call initialize with the player texture, which is load in the player position. So a couple things on this code that I just wrote. All in great detail. Vector2 player position is a new vector2 that we're going to create. That's going to have graphics device.viewport.titleSafeArea.x and then graphics device.viewport.titleSafeArea.y plus the height divided by 2. So what this is going to do is put it on the X title safe area of the screen and on the Y position somewhere between the top and the bottom. In fact, exactly halfway between. So if this is our, if you can envision this notepad pad as where our ship is, our playing area, the ship is going to be here. This is the top Y, this is the bottom Y way down here, and we're drawing it in the middle. Also, we're going to do a content.load of player. Initialize, remember, it takes a texture 2D. Well, that's kind of nice because content.load actually passes us back a texture 2D. So if you look at the definition for content.load, we see that that passes back a templated type. The templated type we're going to set to be texture 2D. So when, if I just comment this out briefly, so when we call initialize, we know that we want a texture 2D. Well, we can do a content.load, and we can tell it to give us a texture 2D out of the load. And we also know that load takes the name of a asset. Our assets before were defined in the shooter content area. And in fact, we've got a player.png that we can load up from there. So that's how that ends up looking. I'm going to go back to the one I had before. So we've got content.load, texture 2D, player, and then player position. Because remember, initialize. Oh, and by the way, if you ever want to go to the definition, you can just click go to definition. It goes immediately to the player.cs file where earlier in this video we defined an initialize to take a texture 2D as well as a position. So we're setting that position to be X and halfway down the Y, and which is what the player position is, and we're also loading up the player PNG, which looks like this. I'm just going to double click on that. That is the player. So that's what we want to load. And just by the way, I want to cover this one line again because it is a little bit complex. This line here in question, basically we could call content.load texture 2D player independently and get back a texture 2D. Something like that, for example. But since all that we're doing is, all the code is basically replacing one thing for another, we might as well just take this entire load call and place it inside of that variable that the initialize function is expecting. And so that's what we do in this case, because this just passes back a texture 2D, which is then itself passed into the initialize function, along with the player position. So, what's next? Stop to think about it for a second. We've added the player with a position, with a texture, with a health, all of that stuff. Inside of our game1.cs, we've initialized the player, we've loaded up the player. Well, if we're ever in doubt of what we can do next, we can always take a look at our design flowchart. What I basically said is we're going to do the player first, and basically the coding up of the player. Well, right here we see draw player. That hasn't been coded up yet. We see updates. Those haven't been coded up yet. Increase player score, draw player score. So there's a ton of stuff to do yet with the player, but specifically what I want to see is the actual player drawing to the screen. That's why I said early on is that player first. So start with drawing the player. So that's what we're going to do is we're going to go to the draw function and we're going to add that code. So this is where your drawing code goes. And remember, like before, you have to actually start out the sprite batch doing a sprite batch.begin. Then you have to do player.draw, because remember, draw was a function that we made on the player, and that does a sprite batch.draw. So in this case, it's passing in the sprite batch, and then the sprite batch itself is going to actually draw it out. The sprite batch we're passing in is the one that we start out to use in game.cs. That sprite batch was defined for us up above here when we first started the project. And that is about it. I'm going to save. And I'm going to compile and I'm going to run. Here's my lovely virus thing. I'm just going to X out of that. And here it is running. We've got our ship, which does nothing. It just draws to the screen. But what we have done is we've coded up a position for the player. We've coded up a health for him, and we've coded up a texture for him. So that's the first step to all of this, and I will see you next time.